So yeah, good afternoon. So look, I'm going to be taking you through a few different things on behalf of the activity that we've been doing on developmenteducation.ie. This is really about storytelling and stories, and using something like the guidelines, which are we've discussed before and we've mentioned before, the guidelines for producing development education and global citizenship education resources, giving you a flavor of some of that as we're going through it. And I'm going to conclude with a number of books that I would recommend, or resources for teaching, and they're very different ones. So I'll go through that now in a second. But just to say, I'm the program manager on developmenteducation.ie, and I know I've met a number of members on the call before and on this session. I'd like you to think of this as kind of an interactive space. So you'll be free to interject as I go along. When I do my bit for about 15 minutes, but certainly for the questions and answer session at the end, that'll be the extended part where we actually get to stuck into the detail and we get to go through anything that you might want to bring with you, or even suggestions of what 5 proper resources should look like, rather than anything that I would suggest. So without further ado, I'm going to, as I said, I am delighted to be part of the series, and I'm going to stick to about 15 to 20 minutes in terms of what I'd like to cover, closer to 15 if I can. So I wonder if anyone else's bookshelves or rooms in your houses or in your apartments or at work look like this. This reminds me of a bookshop down in Wexford called Red Books. So you have to be prepared when you go in, because you may never leave. So anyway, navigating a few resources this time around is what I'd like to do, as I mentioned, covering 5 resources. So I've gone over some of the agenda for today and the Q&A. So yeah, I can see everybody there. So yeah, again, how are you? So in terms of just setting us off then, with a whistle-stop tour, beginning with the guidelines for producing development education resources. A topic like this is quite difficult to say in an eloquent and short phrase, but I'd like to thank everybody on the call and much wider than this session in terms of engaging with the process to renew what might be a set of guidelines to think about producing resources. Storytelling is an important craft of producing teaching resources, and resources that can be used in teaching contexts and learning contexts. And having that sense of ourselves as storytellers is really important. As time has gone on, that has been confirmed to me more and more. And I think that the challenge of what we're faced with now is quite different compared to even 6, 7, 8 years ago. In particular, what is a resource became a question that we were really challenged by, and what's a digital resource? I mean, even from just the graphic I'm showing you here, there's kind of a range of ways of answering that question. So then the follow-on question might be, well, where does it begin, and how do you anchor it, and how do we begin to guide educators through a resource, and learners as well, given the array of options that are in front of us? These are some of the questions these are the kinds of questions that the guidelines will get into. But I think having that sensibility and admitting that up front is a sign of the times. And an important part of admitting this is that we don't have to do it all. So being selective is important, and anchoring what you do into a core story and a core narrative, and all the other tools that lean out of that are important, rather than a single downloadable worksheet, for example, and it being sufficient. How is that anchoring the broader educational outcome and goals? These are questions that I think producers of resources constantly ask themselves. So for us, thinking about being prepared to produce resources and prepared to write stories, it is about preparedness and thinking about the different stages and what's involved, and having a good map of where you're going. The CDC in America produced this zombie pandemic guide for emergency situation preparedness from a US context. The resource is on the resources library that we have online. You can download it and access it. And again, they were using storytelling to do with zombie culture and zombie preparedness and zombie films as a way of encouraging learners and educators and the general public to be prepared for extreme weather events, mostly actually in the US context. This just shows you what you can do with a good story. You can actually communicate quite a lot. The goals that we have in producing the guidelines are quite many, but we're trying to encourage discussion and debate on the rationale that you might pitch. Again, not trying to do it all. Trying to reflect to be more reflective of all the different ways that you might engage content production. So it isn't enough to introduce an issue, but you might decide to use things like the IDEA Code of Good Practice for Development Education or the Code of Good Practice for DE in order to look at a wider range of issues. So the quality check becomes important from the content side as much as it is a quality check on what kind of tools you might decide to use. So the guidelines themselves will be helping you work through what might be your storytelling approach and the decisions you might make and supporting the process in those decisions. The guidelines themselves are going to be more like they'll be double the size of the previous set. I think previously the other one was about 13 to 15 pages. This one will be between 30 and 40 pages. Part of it is to do with the complexity of producing resources today, but also certainly responding to some of the opportunities and the changes of how we communicate issues. I mentioned the Code of Good Practice for Development Education. There's also things like the DOCUS code on images and messages, for example. But there's also many other tools that you can use as part of thinking about the way you would structure content and image selection and the way you might want to tell stories ethically. And I'll show you some tools to do with that today as well. The range of resources that has been produced, what has been done, what are the gaps? These are things that we'll be able to show baseline work, like the audit of development education and GCE resources that developmenteducation.e produced. Having good baselines for what's out there is important for you in thinking about where you might want to go. So again, we're going to have some baselines like this example here. This just shows you from Ireland what resources to do with the SDGs were produced and what coverage of the Sustainable Development Goals themselves look like. So there's a lot of work to be done when you think about the gaps and you look at it in that way. Again, I think I mentioned it'll align with the Code of Good Practice. So just to mention a few spot highlights for you. One of them is about thinking about participation. When producing a resource, we don't always think about how much participation are we willing to involve the learners in, and how are we going to construct that. So the levels of participation might be just a response to something. It might be just do the activity. Are we willing to give over power to the learners for them to decide the journey they're going to go on and make decisions and create actions, as opposed to the phrase that Audrey Bryant has well established in this education work is obedient actions. So are we constructing obedient action opportunities? Or is there a mix of open-ended opportunities? And are we comfortable with what we mean by participation? These are things that are important to include. And when we're conducting a needs assessment as developing the resource, thinking about the learners and their involvement in the production of the resource, but also how they might be, in piloting it, but also what expectation of participation that is left is important, just to mention that. So a lot of the things I'm mentioning here are going to be available in the updated guidelines. As we've said, we're looking to publish it in the next few weeks, in the next 5 weeks or so. In terms of just another example from the guidelines that we're leaning on, the Development Education and Awareness Raising EU Support Team, DEAR, have produced an engagement pyramid, which we're going to include and design up and include in the guidelines themselves. So thinking about how when we're reaching out and we're distributing our resource, what kind of engagement are we hoping, aside from just participation and deciding on actions? How do we rank that in terms of the quality of the engagement itself? And having tools like this are helpful because we can look at it and go, all right, let's make decisions as a team, or maybe there's something we can do to extend further up the pyramid of engagement. So again, this is about having a very strong discussion and reflection and decisions around what kind of engagement we want to support in the development of this particular resource. And the stories that will be attached to that are important, and how we drive the storytelling approach. So what stories of participation do we want from this? Again, thinking about the impact and how we create that are informed by tools like this that we can use. So just in terms of a final piece, I wanted to say there's going to be much more details in the guidelines that you'll be able to use, but thinking about indicators is important. Impact monitoring and evaluation work, something that we did last year as part of a session on impact and quality engagement with members in IDEA, was looking at different kinds of indicators. We're going to create a database of different template indicators that you can use to mix and match and adapt your own resources as you choose. And this will be one of the features of the guidelines, is that it becomes take different indicators and adapt them for your own resource production. So just to really think about that side of impact and integrating that into your own planning. So I mentioned that as well, because those kinds of things are not always easy to find. And I know IDEA has done some fantastic work through different grant rounds and supporting frameworks for thinking about things like your indicators. So we're trying to develop I say a database. It'll be a list that you can use and grab and adapt as you like. So again, supporting the production side from end to end is really important, because these questions of how we're going to measure it may inform earlier stages. So kind of this holistic sense of production is quite important. So yeah, there's more on monitoring and evaluation, but I think the indicators will cover that. Okay, so that's the first part. Now, in terms of just making some recommendations, from my side, coming certainly from us looking at it across the summertime, I know I can't wait to hear some of the recommendations people in the session have about their own resources or books or resources they would like to recommend in terms of developing stories or just good storytelling reference points. I have 5 to recommend for back to school. I think I have am I right in saying about 4 minutes left in my session here, 4 to 5 minutes. So I will be very brief with these. So the first one I would like to recommend is a book by Clementine Ford called Fight Like a Girl. For those that haven't experienced Clementine Ford and her and the force that is Clementine is from an Australian context and has written on many issues to do with girls and women's rights and feminism from an Australian context, but is an outspoken activist on these issues. Her book, Fight Like a Girl, I would highly recommend it as a podcast. Oh, sorry, not as a podcast, as an audio book if you can get it. Listen to Clementine talking through her own experiences of health issues, growing up and reflecting on what it's like being a girl, and not just that, but reflecting on the world around her based on the pressures and culture and society, and how to break some of those cultural tropes, and challenge them is essential reading. And it has not gone out of date at all in terms of when it was produced. And Clementine has more books on the way, and I'd highly recommend it. Check her out. The second one I would recommend is Kaputa by Amalda Chikira and by Deshnan Tenekun. For anybody who is interested in learning about the Sri Lankan conflict and the civil war, but also protests in the last 2 years, here's an interesting book that was produced as a guide for young people to read directly, to learn about issues to do with revolution, violence that's happening, protest. And it's done in a really creative format, which includes, it feels like a mix of poetry, but also closer to the script of a drama. So it's written in this really performative way that's really exciting. And I would encourage everyone to check it out. I know, Aaron, you get a lot from it too. It's down that can be downloaded as an ebook online, so it's freely available. It's open source and it's Creative Commons licensed, and it's an excellent piece to think about conflict in the world today, but specifically from trying to manage that from a young person's perspective with an example written by Sri Lankans for Sri Lankans, but actually has a much wider appeal. So I would highly recommend checking it out. It's fresh out. It's only out in the last year, but it's an exciting piece to run through. You can print it off at A5. It's very quick to look through. Another book I'd recommend, the third one, is Sinead O'Connor on her biography, Rememberings. In her own words, is one that doesn't need a huge amount of introduction at this point, other than to say, since Sinead has died, we owe ourselves a debt to know, to understand, to learn, and to listen much more critically to her words and her legacy than perhaps we have acknowledged that. And I believe there's a space and there's an important responsibility for us to do that actively. Her audiobook is very difficult to get at the moment. I think there's a waiting list up until December based on my local library and the borrowing scheme there, but there's loads of copies of her book at local libraries for you to get your hands on if you want to. So I would only introduce that and say it's Sinead in her own words in terms of her music, her legacy, her reflecting on every one of her albums and the impact, but also key moments in her life. So it's the storytelling side is really important. If we have lots of stories, we have to do a proper duty of care towards. And I think Sinead's is one of the great stories, and there's many stories in there that we need to pay more attention to and respond to. So that's why I'm mentioning Sinead. The next story is actually the next book I'm going to recommend is a comic called Ireti. I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce it correctly, but it's based out of Comic Republic from Nigeria. One of the most ambitious and interesting publishing houses to do with comic books across Africa. And in Nigeria, it has become something of a smash success. You're able to read these comics online, so they are available to look at them issue by issue. And the story of Ireti is one of the more popular ones that has come out from from Comic Republic. In particular, looking at the role of women and how somebody who is an athlete and comes into mythological powers as part of becoming a new superhero created from Nigeria is very interesting as a story. But also separate from that is Ireti is an undergrad in archaeology. So not only is she independent and fiercely creative and academic and an undergrad, but subverts, I think, a lot of the stereotypes that would be held about someone in Ireti's position. And I think the capacity to shift culture and how we see things is important, and particularly the role of women and girls. And this is a great reference point to use. And there's loads of stories that you can access from Comic Republic's website. This is one of them, just to give you that as a reference point. Henry Reynolds has written, I'm almost done. Henry Reynolds is written this book, This Whispering in Our Hearts. He's in the Australian context, thinking about the history of Aborigines and their engagement with settlers, over hundreds of years, becomes an important reference point again and again, and these issues do not go away. And this is a very empathetic and sympathetic historical book for us to listen to and pay attention to. This whispering in our hearts. So I'm referring to this for a number of reasons, not only because it's a classic by Henry Reynolds and a very accessible one for someone looking to grapple with Australian history, but there's going to be the vote on later this year to do specifically with Aboriginal, the Aboriginal communities in Australia and engagement on a treaty. So the subject matter will be a live issue in the next number of months. So I'm referring to this as well as something as an anchor in storytelling, but also an important reference point to navigate this issue educationally. I think it's a good one. So I'd highly recommend Henry Reynolds. The last book, this is book number 6, is a very short reference point. We're going to include this in the guidelines to produce DevEd resources by Africa No Filter. If you haven't checked them out before, you're welcome. They are fantastic in terms of ethical storytelling to do with handbooks for producers and writers, but also for journalists across the continent of Africa and those much further afield in terms of how do you write about stories, in an African context, and the kinds of questions and checks you can have in your own writing process when you encounter those kinds of questions of live issues or how you might want to frame things. It's a great reference point. I would highly recommend everybody to check out. And Africa No Filter are not going away anytime soon. They're not just producing great resources and guides like this, which are immediately available to educators at all levels, but they also support the production of media and multimedia stories across the continent. So I very much recommend them. If I can tag on a different recommendation, The Continent is a newsletter that comes out every 2 weeks. Every week. It's a weekly newsletter from the Mail and Guardian in South Africa that comes through WhatsApp, and it's sent directly through to your own WhatsApp accounts if you're interested in catching news stories. But that's a great summary of different accounts in the news across the continent. So in terms of my bit, that's as much as I wanted to introduce, with a few important stories that came onto my dashboard and certainly ones that excited me over the summertime. We're available for questions and answers and engagement anytime, so we're easily got to and reached. So yeah, that's as much as I'd like to add from my side.